But I always want to ground us in the curriculum and remind everyone um, that this idea of morphology and understanding how words are built and spelled really extends from K to 6. Now, they don't exactly use the word morphology in kindergarten, but they do talk about exploring and playing with new words. And one of the things that Lana and I have both experienced and heard from colleagues in the classroom is that the more opportunities that we can create for oral language and conversation amongst our students, the better we can work to build some of that vocabulary. Because whether you're in kindergarten or I was talking to a high school colleague last week, and a lack of skill set around conversation is really impeding their growth as both readers and writers, even up into the higher grades. So anytime that we can create a situation where we can talk through something is a really valuable learning space. And if the thing we're talking about happens to be morphology, well, how fun is that? Two birds, one stone. You know how that goes. And so in the slide deck of this particular slide, I've linked in the speaker notes because the curriculum does mention specific suffixes and prefixes for some of the grades. So for example, in grade 1, we're looking at plural and the adding of the S or the ES to make a word plural. And as we get into grade 5 and 6, it obviously gets more complex where you're looking at words that have joined in the English language from other countries or other languages, as well as historically, like as Latin and Greek roots. So I'm really hoping that through our work, that we come together is that we can think beyond the worksheet. There's so much more value and richness in a learning experience. And I'm not saying there can't be pencil paper tasks, not at all what I'm saying, but you and I all can call to mind the prefix or suffix worksheet that we have done at some point in our lives as students. And maybe the learning wasn't as fun or didn't stick as well as it could have had we done some deeper exploration. When we talk about morphology, though, we're really not just talking about morphology. We're talking about the entire spelling system, which is wrapped up in the word of orthography. And living under the umbrella of orthography are morphology, which is, the parts and the structure of words, phonology, which is those sounds, that grapheme phoneme correspondence that I know any of you working with the littles are really, really focusing on. And it's also the etymology or the history or the story of the word. Now, sometimes as we explore words, we find ourselves focusing more in on maybe the morphological elements of it. And then other times we're really looking at the history or the story. We have to consider all areas in order for us to understand why something is spelled the way it is. Because one of the pieces that has historically been missing from spelling instruction is understanding that the purpose of English spelling is to communicate meaning first and foremost. And that's where it's helpful to have the story of the word or understanding how the word is built in order for us to develop that meaning connection. If it was all about sounds, well, we would just spell phonetically and goodness gracious help us all, because that just wouldn't get us very far in communicating. As you all know, anyone who's ever tried to decipher the writing of a K1-2 student who doesn't quite have the grasp on things, of how we spell things, to read something that's spelled phonetically is quite challenging. So our brains rely on all of these three parts in order to construct meaning as we read. So quite often what causes us to pause is when we feel like something just isn't making sense. So why is that word spelled like this? Or what is that letter doing there if it doesn't actually have a job? Like, why is it in the word? Or why do these two words rhyme when they don't look the same? Or how is it they look the same, but they don't rhyme? So all of these kinds of questions can lead us into some kind of inquiry, or exploration of words. So, one of the ways that you can think about doing this work is to think of the meaning, think of the structure, and then explore or seek out the story. Discovering the story of a word doesn't always explain the spelling clearly. And as you become more fluent or capable or skilled in digging through the various and vast resources that are out there to understand etymology, you become more skilled in figuring out how that story is in fact like implicating the current spelling of the word. But there are times when you read the story and you're like, oh, that just makes so much sense. Of course, that's the way it's spelled. And so sometimes seeking out the story is really all a learner needs in order to remember the spelling of that word. The word walk. So for those of you that work with the tiniest of people, you might want to back this conversation all the way up to the sounds that we hear. So when I say the word walk, what sounds am I hearing? And so I would model, depending on how you do this, some people tap on their hands, some people do it on their face. And so I would hear walk. So I hear 3 phones or phonemes, depending on how specific you're getting with your students. Here are 3 sounds, w-ak, in that. So I have the W making the w sound. The A is making that ah sound, and the K is making the k sound. Now there's times where we see the word walk and people will dismiss it as irregular, in part because the A isn't saying a or a. But we know that there's other words out there where the A makes that ah sound when, particularly when it's hanging out with the L. So ball, tall, call, all. It's making that same sound. So when you start seeing it over in other words, it's no longer irregular. It's a thing that it can do sometimes. Sometimes the A makes that sound, particularly when it's chilling with the L. And so, we know where the sounds are coming from, but that doesn't necessarily explain what that L is doing in the word walk. So this is where I would have a conversations with my students to say, can anyone use the word walk in a sentence? And I would gather several different walk sentences with my students, and they might naturally offer you other words in the word family. So if you ask for a sentence with the word walk, a student might say, I walked to school. Oh, actually, this is walk plus the ed ending because that was a past tense. The ed is telling us that part. Or I am walking slowly to the store. Oh, you added ing. And so you could kind of feel that out as far if they offer you words that are beyond this base word. So this in itself is a base. And then I'm going to go and hunt out the story. Well, in fact, for those of you that are functioning in any sort of a classroom, probably grade 2 and higher, this book, the Oxford School Dictionary of Word Origins, would be an awesome addition to any school library. Totally written with kids in mind. It has a fun little middle section where it explores prefixes and suffixes, but it also explores like food words and clothing words and where they came from, and all different kinds of things like that. So anyways, and when I look at this book and I look up the word walk, well, I see it's connected in Old English, and now I don't speak Old English, but something like wilken may have been the Old English word, and it meant to roll or to wander. So we can see that connection in our current meaning of the word walk, but there's an L here. So in fact, the L in walk and, spoiler alert, the L in talk are markers. They are little flags for us to understand where it came from. And in this particular case, they both came out of Old English. And so that L is there as a flag or a nod to the history of the word. And so sometimes just knowing that story makes them go, oh, okay, I get it now. Or it can be the reminder. What did we learn about the story of walk? What letter did you miss in your spelling? Oh, right, there's an L in there because it's connected to Old English. Then I might have a conversation with my students where I am exploring or asking them to branch out that word into the morphological family, where walk would be in the middle. And I would be asking them to come up with or brainstorm all of the words that they think might be part of the walk family. When it's in a word family, it shares a common base element. You can also think of that as spelling and root or meaning. So it shares some spelling, it shares some meaning, therefore it lives in the word family. So in the chat box, can you offer up a word that you think is part of the walk family? So this brings us into work around word sums. And what a word sum does is allows us to visually see how a word is built in its parts. The reason this is important, well, there's many reasons, but when you start unpacking with students why words are spelt the way they are, well, it does a couple of things. You start with one word and it ultimately leads you to more than one word. So we started with the word walk and we now have walking, walked, walker. So it automatically leads you into more vocabulary exposure. The other thing it does is tunes students into this idea that by adding little bits onto base words, we build new words. Pre-walk. Could you use pre-walk in a sentence, Lana?
I might be able to. Like, could I go for a pre-walk before I went for my run?
I don't know. Well, then we would have to do some exploring if we could find it somewhere else. Is that a word anyone else has ever heard? I personally haven't, but that doesn't mean anything. Might visit my good friend the Google and see if anything comes up there. The other great thing when you start building word sums is a word sum collection really isn't ever quote unquote done. So you can always go and add to it afterwards as students start to pay attention to other words. Now, one of the conversations that you can have with students around suffixes. So not every time you see ER in a word means that that is a suffix. So you could have them hunt out or seek out examples and non-examples of when ER is acting as a suffix and when ER is actually just part of the base word. So danger is an example. Her is another example. The base of her is her. It's not the letter H plus ER. The other thing that word sums, pre-walking or cruising shoes are the shoes that babies need first. Okay. So Lana's got pre-walking as a type of shoe. So then I would offer this as PRE plus WALK plus the suffix OING is rewritten as PREWALKING, pre-walking. It might be hyphenated, but you can include hyphenated words in a word matrix or in a word sum. And maybe you put a little star beside it and we're going to say, friends, we're going to pay attention for this one and see if we can find it anywhere out in the universe, because it might be out there. And kids love to either prove you right or prove you wrong. So go ahead and toss that out there as a little challenge to see if they can find an example of this. But one of the things that building word sums helps us do, and this comes back to us having to break some habits here. When I do the base word, I spell it out. And the reason I spell it out with just the letters is because you can get in a situation where the base word changes pronunciation or the grapheme phoneme correspondence changes when you add on different suffixes. And I think one of the reasons that we get in a place where spelling seems quote unquote ridiculous sometimes is because the pronunciation of the letters are changing as it builds out new words in the family. Okay, so here is an example of one I just did a little video on for my son's class, well, for the world, but really it's for my son's class. Okay, so the word family do, you may be shocked, includes the words does and done. Oops. Okay, now when I read this word sum, I need to make sure that I say do plus es is rewritten as does, does. Because if I say do plus es is rewritten as does, that's when we go, oh no, it doesn't. Like that just sounds wacky. And so when we don't pronounce the base word and we simply read out the letters and then add the suffix, obviously you do the prefix first, then I think our brains are more accepting, our hearts are more accepting of the change or the shift in pronunciation. So do plus ne, which is in fact a suffix used to create past participles. There's other words where it's used. Just trust me on this. We're not getting down that rabbit hole today. So it's do plus ne is rewritten as done, done. If I said do plus ne is rewritten as done, again, you're creating confusion. So here's a common example of a sound that changes as you build out new words in the family. This changing of pronunciations is not uncommon. So think of the word sign. If I have the word signs, so sign plus s is rewritten as signs, signs. But if I have the word signal, which is part of the family, sign plus al is rewritten as signal, signal. So the pronunciation has changed, even though it's part of what we would call the sign family. So they're related in spelling and meaning, but the pronunciation is changing as we add on different morphemes. So Cindy, you're wondering, why does the pronunciation change? Well, in this particular case, in signal, we have a break in the syllabication there, right? And so I'm assuming that has something to do with it. And this would be one of those situations where, like, I honestly don't have all the answers. But now we've created a situation that I'm going to start researching. So the next time we come together, hopefully I have a little clearer of an explanation to you around why that happens. I think part of the important conversation is that we point out to students that it A, does happen, and B, it's okay that it happens. It's all part of the design of the language, as opposed to dismissing it as wacky old English, that it's common. It happens in lots of different words, and there are likely multiple reasons why that shift occurs.
But also looking, Charlie, at the meaning of the word, right? That a signal is the sign. So that does belong in the meaning of this family, right? And that
Yeah.
is what is, that's what a family is that they are related in meaning. And we know when we add suffixes that there are going to be changes to the pronunciation of words, right? So in this case, with signal, there is that shift, right? Phonologically speaking, but they belong in the same family because a signal is a sign, right?
Hmm. And to me, it's just part of this um, change in how we engage in the conversation. So I'm going to bring you all back to part of my very long worded email last month. But we ended off, as you recall, with a question. Does carelessly have two suffixes, or is there just one? And so originally my answer was, well, yes, the base word is care plus less as a suffix plus ly, carelessly. Um, and then that was that. Well, of course, my brain kept going, and then I was like, nope, that's maybe not right, because care and less would be a compound word. So maybe it's just, not that. Anyway, I couldn't help myself, because I was talking and doing a recording with Fiona Hamilton and Rebecca Lovelace, and it totally worked in the conversation, friends. I did not just hijack the session we were doing, but I asked them about carelessly, and the interesting part was Rebecca's first instinct was very similar to mine. Yeah, that makes sense. Two suffixes. And then Fiona's like, well, no, that doesn't make sense, because if you're homeless, you don't have less of a house. Like, it's not that you're carrying less, or you have less of a home. It's changing its meaning as it's been added. And she's like, so I think it's not necessarily looking at it as two base words plus a suffix, but we're looking at less as its own suffix that's changing the meaning of that base word. And just the fact that that was the conversation, I think, is the whole point of this work. That we're willing to investigate, that we're willing to question, and just pause instead of dismiss. And to me, that's the difference.
Well, you know what? I'm just thinking the beauty of that, though, is the conversation that you've had around a word that is questionable. Kids won't forget it, right? So the more conversation you have around words, the more that you talk about words, the spelling of those words will be correct down the way. And that's what we want. We want the understanding of the word, to know the meaning, but that they spell the words correctly in their everyday writing, right? So when you spend some time conversing about words and challenging each other with those questions, then that stuff isn't forgotten. And the likelihood that they're going to spell those words correctly moving forward is way higher than it would be if it's just a listed word on a spelling test, right?
If you haven't had a chance to explore this site, I truly encourage you to do it. Maybe I want my students to explore the word Christmas because, 'tis the season, but I'm going to make sure that I read the entry first, and make sure that what's provided is actually going to be helpful for them to understand the origin of that particular word. One of the words Lana had wanted to explore today was the word said. Um, and what is going on there with the word said? Well, we know it's connected to the word say, and that tells us down here, and it goes into this big, long descriptor, but it doesn't actually ever say, I did not mean to make a pun there. It doesn't actually ever say why the I is there in said. So, my Christmas gift to you, friends, comes from the High Frequency Word Project. The Old English word said, and it would have been pronounced said, Sayed. Those were not the letters that were involved. There were some Old English letters, obviously, in place of that instead. Over time, the I was the Y was shifted into an I. And we know that Y and I are kind of like BFFs, and they hang out together and help each other out. So if you're ever talking vowels with your students, you can do it on their hand, which is AEIOU, and the I is the middle finger, and then you write Y on their palm. And so the middle finger and the palm hang out together, and students know that Y and I help each other out with a lot of different spellings. The design of it, of SAID, as opposed to replacing that A with like an E, because of the S sound, would be because we need to visually connect it to the words say and says. So we still need that visual to align us with those words that it's historically connected to, while honoring some of its growth. And so we have say and says and saying and said that are all connected in meaning, although they may not share the exact same spelling.